I am Harper, 34 years old, and until tonight I thought I had built a tolerable life in Atlanta. My husband of 7 years had just raised his crystal glass to toast his own success at our anniversary dinner. Sitting next to him was my best friend Chantel, and across from us were my sister-in-law, Ebony, and her white husband, Wyatt. When I pulled out the ultrasound photos of Chantel carrying my husband's twins and dropped them right onto his expensive Wagyu steak, the entire table went dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy the perfect facade of a toxic family. The crystal chandelier above our table cast a warm golden glow over the private dining room at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in Buckhead. It was our 7th wedding anniversary, but you would never know it by listening to the conversation. Malik, my husband of 7 years, was holding court. He sat at the head of the table wearing a tailored navy suit that I had paid for, radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only a mediocre man propped up by a successful woman could muster. He swirled the expensive bourbon in his glass and smiled broadly at his sister Ebony and her husband Wyatt. "Let me tell you about hard work," Malik was saying, his voice booming with arrogant pride. "When I took over that car dealership, people said the luxury auto market in Atlanta was too saturated. They said a black man could not dominate the high-end import game in this district. But look at us now. We just crushed our quarterly goals, and I am thinking about opening a second location by next spring. It takes vision to build an empire from the ground up." He paused, waiting for the praise he felt he was owed. Ebony clapped her hands together, leaning forward with a hungry gleam in her eyes. "That is what I am talking about, big brother. You are the true definition of a self-made man. In fact, since business is booming so much, Wyatt and I were hoping you could co-sign on our new mortgage application. The bank is giving us a hard time about Wyatt's fluctuating commissions, but with your signature, we could close on that house in Alpharetta by the end of the month." Malik puffed out his chest and waved his hand dismissively, as if signing away hundreds of thousands of dollars was a trivial matter. "Say no more, Ebony. You know I always take care of my family. I will have my finance guy send over the paperwork tomorrow morning. Family has to look out for family." Wyatt, sitting next to Ebony, adjusted his tie and offered a condescending smile. He was a white insurance broker who always seemed to carry a subtle air of superiority whenever he sat at our table. "I appreciate that, Malik. It is a tough market out there right now. You have to be aggressive. You have to take risks. I always tell my junior brokers that real men create their own luck. You built that dealership with your own 2 hands, and that is something to respect." I sat quietly at the opposite end of the table, cutting my steak with slow, deliberate motions. Not one of them mentioned where the capital for that dealership actually came from. Not one of them acknowledged that my commercial real estate investments and my chain of luxury wellness spas had provided the $2 million collateral required to open those doors. To them, I was just the silent wallet, the cold corporate wife who was lucky to have such a charismatic man by her side. And then there was Chantel, my best friend since college, sitting right next to Malik. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress that I had purchased for her birthday just 2 months ago. Chantel was an event planner who specialized in high-end weddings, always hovering on the edges of Atlanta's elite circles, but never quite breaking through on her own merit. She leaned over and placed her hand gently on Malik's forearm, her manicured fingers resting there just a second too long. "You really are an inspiration, Malik," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Harper is so incredibly lucky to have a man who provides so well for her. Most men would be intimidated by a woman who works as much as Harper does, but you just let her do her little spa thing while you build the real legacy. I do not know how you do it." Malik patted her hand and gave her a warm, appreciative look. "It takes a lot of patience, Chantel. You know how it is. Harper is married to her work. Someone has to be the anchor of this family." I stopped cutting my steak. I placed my knife and fork down on the pristine white tablecloth. The sheer audacity of the scene playing out in front of me was almost cinematic. For years, I had endured the subtle disrespect, the financial drain, and the emotional manipulation because I believed in the sanctity of marriage. I believed that family was paramount, but the truth was no longer something I could ignore. The private investigator I had hired 3 weeks ago had delivered a highly detailed file to my office that very morning. Malik raised his glass of bourbon, holding it up toward the chandelier. To 7 years of marriage, he announced, looking at me with a hollow smile, and to the beautiful family we are building, may the next 7 years be even more fruitful. Ebony, Wyatt, and Chantel all raised their glasses. Cheers to the happy couple, Chantel said, locking eyes with me. I did not touch my glass. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my black quilted Chanel bag. The leather was soft under my fingers, a stark contrast to the cold fury currently freezing my veins. I unclasped the lock and reached inside, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Is that a gift?" Ebony asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. "Did you get him the Rolex he was looking at?" "No," I said, my voice steady and perfectly modulated. "It is not a Rolex." I stood up from my chair. The room was quiet except for the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers. I walked slowly around the large oak table until I was standing directly between Malik and Chantel. Malik looked up at me, his confident smile faltering slightly at the intense expression on my face. I opened the envelope. I pulled out the crisp white legal document and placed it squarely on top of his partially eaten Wagyu steak. The grease from the meat immediately began to seep into the bottom of the page, but the bold black letters at the top remained perfectly legible. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Before anyone could process what they were looking at, I reached into the envelope again. This time, I pulled out a glossy strip of thermal paper. It was a high-resolution ultrasound image, clearly showing two distinct fetal sacs. I dropped the ultrasound directly onto Chantel's empty dessert plate. "Happy anniversary, Malik," I said. The words cut through the air like shards of glass. Malik stared at the divorce papers, his jaw going slack. He looked down at the steak, then over at the ultrasound photo on Chantel's plate. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. "Harper, what is this?" he stammered, his voice completely losing its previous booming authority. "Are you crazy? What kind of sick joke are you playing in front of our family?" Chantel stared at the ultrasound photo and let out a dramatic gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She immediately shifted into the role she played best, the helpless victim. "Harper, I can explain," Chantel cried, her voice trembling as forced tears welled up in her eyes. "Please do not do this right now. We did not mean to hurt you. It just happened. We were going to tell you, but we did not know how." Ebony slammed her hands on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Wait a minute," she shouted, looking back and forth between her brother and my best friend. "Chantel is pregnant with twins, Malik's twins." Wyatt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face turning a blotchy red. He reached out and grabbed Ebony's arm, trying to pull her back down. "Keep your voice down, Ebony. We are in a public place." He turned his gaze to me, his expression shifting into that familiar, condescending mask. "Harper, you need to calm down. You are acting hysterical. Men make mistakes. It is basic biology. You cannot just throw a marriage away over a simple lapse in judgment. Let us all sit down, take a breath, and handle this like rational adults." I turned my gaze to Wyatt, locking eyes with him until he looked away. "Do not ever tell me to calm down, Wyatt. You sit there begging for my money to fund your suburban dreams, and then have the nerve to tell me how to react to my husband impregnating my best friend. Keep your mouth shut before I decide to expose exactly how you spend your weekends when Ebony thinks you are at insurance seminars." Wyatt swallowed hard and shrank back into his chair, absolutely silent. Chantel was now sobbing openly, clutching her stomach as if she needed to protect the babies from my presence. "Harper, you have to understand my position," she wailed. "Malik was so lonely. You are always at your clinics, always managing your properties. You never gave him the warmth he needed, and you know how much he wanted to be a father. He needed a legacy, Harper. He needed children of his own blood. It is not his fault you could not give him that. You are too cold, too focused on money. Someone had to give him a real family. The cruelty of her words hung in the room. They all knew about my struggles. They all knew about the 3 failed rounds of in vitro fertilization that had left my body bruised and my spirit exhausted. They knew the tears I had cried in private. And now my so-called best friend was weaponizing my deepest pain to justify her own betrayal. Ebony quickly rallied behind her brother. Chantel is right, Harper. You cannot just cut him off because he wanted to be a father. You chose your businesses over giving him a family. You made him feel like less of a man. If you divorce him now, you are just proving how selfish you really are. You cannot strip him of his rights just because you are bitter. I looked at the people sitting around this table. This was the family I had married into. A group of parasites who justified betrayal and demanded financial support in the exact same breath. They truly believed that my money was their birthright and that my feelings were completely irrelevant. I did not cry, I did not scream. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my solid metal black card. I raised my hand and signaled the waiter who had been nervously hovering near the entrance of the private room. Check, please. I called out, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. The waiter scurried over and presented the leather billfold. I placed my black card inside and handed it back to him. Malik watched me, his eyes wide with rising panic. You think you are so tough? Harper Malik sneered, trying to recover a shred of his dignity. You think you can just embarrass me and walk away? Fine. Go ahead and file the papers. But Georgia law is very clear. We have been married for 7 years. I am entitled to half of everything. Half of the commercial properties, half of the wellness centers, half of the house in Buckhead. And the car dealership is mine. My name is on the front door. You cannot touch my business. I will drag you through court until you have nothing left. I waited for the waiter to return with the receipt. I signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish, added a generous 20% tip, and picked up my card. I turned back to Malik and offered him a smile that was completely devoid of any warmth. You really should pay more attention to the documents you sign, Malik, I said softly. You do not own the car dealership. You never did. You are a salaried employee of the holding company that I established before we even got married. Your name is on the front door because I paid for the sign. And as the sole owner and chief executive officer of that holding company, I am officially terminating your employment effective immediately. You are fired, Malik. Malik's mouth dropped open. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. You cannot do that. That is my livelihood. I already did, I replied. Security has already cleared out your office. Your company car has been repossessed from the valet parking lot downstairs. The joint credit cards were deactivated 30 minutes ago. Oh, and about that mortgage co-sign you promised Ebony. You might want to let her know that your current income is 0. Ebony gasped, covering her mouth. Wyatt stared at Malik in pure horror, realizing his new house was slipping through his fingers. I picked up my Chanel bag and adjusted the strap on my shoulder. You wanted a legacy, Malik. You wanted a family with Chantel. Well, now you have it. I hope she enjoys supporting a broke, unemployed man with twins on the way. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the... I turned and walked out of the private dining room, my heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. The silence I left behind was absolute. I walked through the main dining area, past the staring patrons, and stepped out into the cool evening air of Atlanta. The valet brought my Porsche around immediately. As I slid into the driver's seat, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Ruby, my mother-in-law. News traveled fast in their family. The message read, "Get home right now. I do not care what Malik did. You do not tear this marriage apart. Do not you dare embarrass this family in front of outsiders. We will fix this." I stared at the glowing screen, reading her demands. Ruby, the matriarch of the family, the woman who controlled her children with an iron fist and religious guilt, thought she could command me to accept this disrespect. She thought I was going to fold. I put the car in gear and smiled. The war had just begun. The scent of eucalyptus and lavender usually brought me peace. But this morning, the expensive aromatherapy floating through the air of my wellness center felt suffocating. I sat behind my massive glass desk, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the bustling Atlanta streets below. The morning sun was bright and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the imported marble floors of my private office. I was wearing a tailored white suit, a deliberate choice to project power and immaculate control. My hands were folded perfectly over a stack of legal documents. I had not slept a single minute since I drove away from that steakhouse. My mind had been racing, calculating my next moves, protecting my assets, and preparing for the inevitable storm. I knew the storm was coming. I knew they would not simply walk away quietly. I took a deep breath and repeated my silent mantra. I will not break, I will not bend, I will not break, I will not bend. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office swung open with a violent force that rattled the hinges. There was no knock. There was no announcement from my receptionist. Ruby, my mother-in-law, marched into the room like a general invading conquered territory. She was wearing a lavender church suit complete with a matching wide-brimmed hat, as if she had come straight from Sunday service to deliver divine judgment. Her face was set in a mask of righteous fury. Trailing closely behind her was Malik. He looked completely different from the arrogant man holding a glass of bourbon the night before. His shoulders were slumped, and he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, acting like a scolded child seeking protection behind his mother. Yet I could still see the toxic pride simmering just beneath his surface. He was humiliated, but he was not sorry. And then came Chantel. She hovered near the doorway, wrapping her arms protectively around her stomach. She had traded her emerald silk dress for an oversized beige sweater, doing her absolute best to look small, fragile, and victimized. She refused to make eye contact with me, playing the role of the innocent bystander who had simply been swept up in a tragic romance. Ruby stopped in the center of the room, planting her hands firmly on her hips. She looked around my pristine office, her eyes dripping with absolute contempt. "You think you are God?" she demanded, her voice booming through the quiet space. "You think because your name is on a few bank accounts, you have the right to destroy my son and humiliate this family?" I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and looked at the woman who had spent 7 years treating me like an ATM machine wrapped in a wedding dress. "You texted me last night to come home." "Ruby," I said, my voice perfectly flat. "As you can see, I am at work. If you have a wellness appointment, my receptionist can help you outside. If not, you are trespassing on private commercial property." Ruby took a step closer to my desk, her eyes blazing with absolute rage. "Do not you dare speak to me like some stranger off the street, Harper. I am the matriarch of this family, and you will show me the respect I deserve. I raised Malik to be a king, and I will not let a bitter barren woman strip him of his crown just because his seed found a more fertile field." The cruelty of her words was designed to paralyze me. She wanted to use my deepest trauma to break my spirit. Malik finally looked up, his face shifting into an expression of false pleading. "Harper, please listen to my mother," Malik said, his voice adopting that smooth, manipulative tone he used when he wanted money. "We can work this out. We do not have to destroy everything we built. I love you. Chantel and I just made a mistake, but the babies are a blessing. We can all be a family. You can still be a mother to them." Chantel let out a dramatic whimper from the doorway. "We can share them, Harper," she cried softly, wiping a tear that did not exist. "I know how much you want a baby. We can all live together. We can make this work for the children." The sheer delusion radiating from the three of them was physically nauseating. They truly believed I would accept this level of disrespect to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage. Ruby slammed her hand flat against my glass desk, leaning over to stare directly into my eyes. "Family comes first," Ruby declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Family comes first. Harper, you took vows before God. Men stray and men make mistakes. It is the burden of a strong Black woman to forgive and keep the home intact. You are not going to fire my son, you are not going to divorce him, and Chantel is carrying the blood of this family. Her apartment is too small for twins, and her pregnancy is high risk. You need to let her move into the large suburban house in Alpharetta so she can rest." You will provide for my grandchildren because family comes first. I stared at Ruby, listening to the echo of her demands. They wanted my money. They wanted my property. They wanted me to fund the lifestyle of my husband and his pregnant mistress because it was my duty as a woman. I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed the lapels of my white suit. I looked at Ruby, then at Malik, then at Chantel. Family comes first, I said softly. Ruby nodded her chin, lifting with victory, assuming I was finally submitting to her authority. That is right, she said. Family comes first. Family comes first. I repeated the phrase, rolling off my tongue like a heavy stone. You say family comes first, Ruby. Family comes first. You stood in my kitchen 3 years ago crying real tears and told me family comes first. Family comes first, so I wired $100,000 to the Internal Revenue Service so your son would not wear a federal jumpsuit for tax evasion. Family comes first. Malik flinched, taking a step back as the truth of his financial failures was laid bare in front of Chantel. Family comes first. I continued, my voice rising with a rhythmic, unyielding intensity. Is that why family comes first when you begged me to buy that beautiful brick house in Decatur because the bank would not look twice at your terrible credit score? Family comes first. Is that why family comes first when I paid for your knee surgery because Malik had gambled away his commission check? Family comes first. Family comes first. Every single time you say family comes first, it means Harper pays the bill. Every time you say family comes first, it means I sacrifice my peace to fund your delusions. Family comes first. Family comes first. I am completely sick of putting your family first. Ruby opened her mouth to speak, but I did not let her. I reached onto my desk and picked up the thick stack of legal documents I had been reviewing before they barged in. I tossed the papers across the glass surface until they stopped right in front of Ruby's hands. That house in Decatur is in my name, Ruby, I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. My holding company holds the deed. You have exactly 30 days to pack your church hats, your designer shoes that I paid for, and your absolute audacity. You have 30 days to get out of my property. I am officially initiating eviction proceedings. Ruby stared at the eviction notice, her mouth falling open in genuine shock. She looked at the legal seal on the paper, and then looked up at me. The realization that she was losing her comfortable home finally penetrated her arrogant armor. Her entire body began to shake with indignation. She had been the undisputed ruler of her family for decades, and no one had ever dared to challenge her power or take away her comfort. You ungrateful witch, Ruby shrieked, losing every ounce of her church-going dignity. You think you can throw me out on the street? I will destroy your reputation in this city. I will tell everyone at the church what a cold, heartless monster you are. I smiled. Tell them, Ruby. Tell the entire congregation that your sterile son needed my money to look like a man, and your best friend decided to be his surrogate. See how many prayers that gets you. Ruby was completely blinded by rage. Her matriarchal authority was shattered, and her mind could only resort to violence. She let out a guttural scream and raised her right hand, swinging it toward my face with all the force she could muster. She wanted to slap the defiance out of me, just like she did to her own children. I did not flinch. I did not step back. As her hand came hurtling toward my cheek, I shot my left arm up and caught her wrist firmly in midair. My grip was like iron. The momentum of her swing halted instantly, sending a shockwave up her arm. Ruby gasped in pain, her eyes widening in disbelief as she struggled to pull her hand back. I held her wrist suspended between us, feeling her pulse racing under my fingers. Malik stepped forward, puffing his chest out. Harper, let go of my mother, he yelled, stepping toward the desk. I tightened my grip on Ruby's wrist, keeping my eyes locked dead on Malik. Take one more step, Malik. I warned, my voice dangerously low. Take one more step, and I will have my security guards throw all 3 of you through the front glass doors. Malik stopped dead in his tracks, his courage evaporating instantly. Chantel let out a terrified squeak and backed further into the hallway, pressing herself against the doorframe. I looked back at Ruby, who was now breathing heavily, her face contorted in a mixture of pain and profound humiliation. I slowly and deliberately pushed her arm away, dropping her wrist as if touching her disgusted me. "Get out of my office," I commanded, pointing toward the door. "Get out of my building. And start packing your boxes, Ruby. The clock is ticking." Ruby rubbed her wrist, her chest heaving. She looked like a defeated general staring at the ruins of her own empire. She turned around without saying another word, grabbing Malik by the sleeve of his suit and dragging him toward the door. Chantel scurried out of the way, letting them pass before hurrying after them like a frightened mouse. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, leaving my office in absolute silence. I stood alone, listening to the sound of my own steady breathing. My hands were not shaking. I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. I had done it. I had finally severed the parasitic cord that had drained my life for 7 long years. I walked around to the front of my desk and picked up the eviction papers, placing them back into a neat stack. I felt lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of supporting people who secretly hated me was gone. Suddenly, a sharp buzzing sound broke the silence in the room. My cell phone was vibrating violently on the corner of my desk. The screen flashed with an urgent emergency alert from my chief financial officer. I frowned, feeling a sudden prickle of unease at the base of my neck. I picked up the phone and opened the encrypted message. The words on the screen made the blood freeze in my veins. Urgent notification. All primary business operating accounts have just been frozen. The bank received an emergency court injunction 20 minutes ago. We cannot process payroll. We cannot process vendor payments. All outgoing transfers are blocked by order of a superior court judge. I stared at the screen, trying to process the magnitude of the message. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I scrolled down to read the attached legal filing. Malik's name was at the very top of the document. He had not just been sitting idle while I prepared the divorce papers. He had hired a ruthless litigation firm. They had filed an emergency ex parte motion claiming that I was maliciously liquidating marital assets and attempting to illegally transfer joint business funds into offshore accounts. The judge had granted a temporary freeze on all my corporate accounts until a formal hearing could be conducted. Malik and his lawyer had successfully paralyzed my entire business empire with a single legal maneuver. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the street below. I could see Ruby, Malik, and Chantel walking toward the parking garage. Malik stopped for a moment and looked up toward my office window. Even from this distance, I could see the arrogant, smug smile spreading across his face. He knew exactly what time the injunction was scheduled to hit my bank accounts. He knew he had just cut off my oxygen. They thought they had won. They thought freezing my money would force me to crawl back to the negotiation table and surrender to their demands. They thought I was just a woman who got lucky with a few good investments. I clenched my phone tightly in my hand, the metal casing digging into my palm. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. The adrenaline in my system transformed instantly into a cold, calculated focus. Malik wanted to play a dirty game of financial warfare. He wanted to use the legal system to hold my businesses hostage while his mistress carried his children. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I picked up my office phone and dialed the direct line to my senior legal counsel. The dial tone rang twice before it was answered. "Get the litigation team in the boardroom right now," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Malik just declared war. And I am going to make sure he leaves the battlefield with absolutely nothing. To 7 years of marriage and to the beautiful family we are building," my husband Malik announced, raising his crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He flashed his signature charismatic smile at his sister Ebony, her husband Wyatt, and my best friend Chantel. I didn't touch my glass. Instead, I reached into my quilted Chanel bag, pulled out a crisp manila envelope, and dropped the contents directly onto Malik's half-eaten Wagyu steak. The grease immediately seeped into the bold black letters of the petition for dissolution of marriage. Right next to it, on Chantel's pristine dessert plate, I dropped a glossy ultrasound photo showing 2 distinct fetal sacs. "Happy anniversary, Malik," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz of the exclusive Buckhead Steakhouse. "I hope you and Chantel are ready to fund those twins yourselves, because I am officially cutting you off." The table went dead silent. Malik's arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer panic as he stared at the ultrasound. Chantel gasped immediately, covering her face to play the victim. "Harper, please, we didn't mean to—" "Save it," I interrupted, standing up. "For 7 years, I let you play the self-made king Malik. I funded your car dealership with my commercial real estate assets. I paid for this dinner, the suit on your back, and the roof over your head. And you repay me by sleeping with my best friend." Ebony slammed her hands on the table. "You can't just walk out on him, Harper. He wanted a legacy. You're always at your wellness centers and everyone knows you couldn't give him kids. You pushed him into this. The cruelty of weaponizing my grueling IVF struggles didn't break me. It only fueled my cold fury." Wyatt, trying to play the superior peacemaker, reached out. "Harper, calm down. Let's handle this rationally. Men make mistakes." "Keep your mouth shut, Wyatt," I snapped, locking eyes with him. "You sit here begging Malik to co-sign your suburban mortgage with my money while spending your weekends doing God knows what when Ebony thinks you're at insurance seminars." Wyatt turned pale and shrank back into his seat. Malik tried to recover his pride, sneering. "You think you can just fire me as a husband? I'll take half of your spas, the house, the dealership. Georgia law will back me." I smiled. "The dealership belongs to my holding company. You are a salaried employee, and as of 20 minutes ago, you are fired. Your company car has been repossessed from the valet, and the joint cards are deactivated." I turned and walked out of the private dining room, leaving them drowning in their own ruins. The war had just begun. The scent of eucalyptus and lavender in my primary wellness center usually brought me peace, but the next morning the air felt charged. I sat behind my glass desk in a tailored white suit, methodically revoking banking authorizations, when my heavy office doors swung open with violent force. Ruby, my mother-in-law, marched in like an invading general in her purple church suit. Trailing behind her was Malik, looking like a scolded child, and Chantel wearing an oversized sweater and clutching her stomach to play the fragile martyr. "You think you are God?" Ruby boomed, slamming her hands on my desk. "You think because your name is on a few bank accounts, you can destroy my son. Family comes first. Harper, it is the burden of a strong woman to forgive. Chantel is carrying my grandchildren. You will let her move into the Alpharetta house, and you will provide for them." They were entirely delusional, expecting me to fund my husband's pregnant mistress. "Family comes first," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Like when I wired $100,000 to the IRS so your son wouldn't go to federal prison? Like when I bought that brick house in Decatur for you because his credit was garbage? Every time you say family comes first, it means Harper pays the bill." I am done. I picked up a legal document and tossed it across the glass right into Ruby's hands. "That Decatur house is in my holding company's name. You have exactly 30 days to pack your church hats and get out. I am evicting you." Ruby's face contorted with pure rage. Her matriarchal authority was shattered. Letting out a guttural scream, she raised her hand and swung at my face with all her might. I didn't flinch. I shot my left arm up and caught her wrist firmly in midair. Her momentum halted instantly. I held her wrist suspended, feeling her pulse race under my fingers. "Take one more step, Malik," I warned as he puffed his chest out to intervene, "and my security team will throw all 3 of you through the front glass doors." I shoved Ruby's arm away in disgust. "Get out of my building. The clock is ticking." Ruby rubbed her wrist, her empire in ruins, and dragged Malik and Chantel out of my office. As the doors shut, leaving me in absolute silence, a sharp buzzing sound broke the peace. My cell phone was vibrating violently. I opened the encrypted message from my chief financial officer. The words made my blood run cold. "Urgent notification. All primary business operating accounts have just been frozen by an emergency court injunction. All outgoing transfers blocked." I walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot. Malik was looking up at my office, an arrogant smirk on his face. He had hired a ruthless lawyer to file a fraudulent ex parte motion, paralyzing my empire to force a surrender. I clenched my phone tightly, the adrenaline transforming into cold, calculated focus. I turned back to my desk and picked up my office phone. The dial tone hummed in my ear for only a second before my lead attorney answered the phone, and I told her to assemble the entire legal team in the main boardroom immediately, because Malik had just crossed a line he could not uncross. I walked out of my office and headed straight down the long glass hallway of my wellness center, feeling the eyes of my staff on me as I maintained a perfectly calm exterior. Inside the boardroom, my lawyers and my chief financial officer were already pulling up the emergency court injunction on the projection screen. My lead attorney, a brilliant woman named Sarah, explained that Malik and his sleazy lawyer had filed a massive motion claiming I was secretly funneling marital assets into hidden offshore accounts. It was a complete fabrication, but they had managed to convince a judge to freeze my primary operating accounts for 48 hours pending a review. My financial officer pointed out something even more disturbing. The paperwork showed that Wyatt had used his connections as an insurance broker to provide fraudulent risk assessments to the court, making it look like my businesses were in financial jeopardy. Wyatt was playing a dangerous game trying to help his brother-in-law steal my money, just so he could secure his own suburban mortgage. They thought freezing my accounts would suffocate me into submission, but they severely underestimated how many layers of security I had built around my empire. I told my team to reroute the payroll through our secondary trust, which was completely shielded from the injunction, and to prepare a massive countersuit for defamation and financial sabotage. While we were sitting in the boardroom fighting the legal battle, my phone began to vibrate with endless notifications from social media. My assistant walked into the room holding her tablet, looking hesitant and deeply uncomfortable. She placed the tablet on the table and told me I needed to see what was happening online. Chantel had just gone live on her personal page, and the video was already spreading like wildfire across the local Atlanta networks. I pressed play and watched my former best friend put on the performance of a lifetime. Chantel was sitting on the edge of a bed, wearing an oversized cardigan, holding a tissue to her face, and sobbing quietly into the camera. She told her thousands of followers that she was carrying a heavy burden and needed to speak her truth. She painted a picture of a tragic love story where she was the savior and I was the villain. Chantel looked directly into the camera and said, "It broke her heart to see Malik suffering for years in a cold and loveless marriage. She called me a barren workaholic who cared more about commercial real estate than building a warm home. She wiped away her fake tears and claimed that Malik only turned to her because he was starved for affection and desperate to have a real family with children of his own blood. She framed her pregnancy not as a betrayal, but as a divine intervention, a blessing meant to rescue a man from a miserable life with a woman who could not fulfill her natural duties." The sheer manipulation of her words made my stomach churn, but I did not look away from the screen. Chantel was actively weaponizing my private medical struggles involving in vitro fertilization to make herself the ultimate victim. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was targeting the conservative values of our community, playing the role of the fertile, nurturing mother figure against the cold, corporate career woman. The comments section beneath the video was a toxic wasteland of judgment and cruel assumptions. People who did not even know me were calling me bitter and selfish. The fallout was almost immediate. My wellness spas catered heavily to the affluent women of the local church community, where Ruby held significant influence. Within 2 hours of Chantel posting that video, the phone lines at my front desk began ringing constantly. Women were calling to cancel their premium spa memberships and massage appointments. They cited vague moral concerns, stating they could not support a business owned by a woman who drove her husband to another bed. Ruby was clearly working behind the scenes, calling every prayer circle and charity committee member to ensure my reputation was dragged through the mud. They were trying to hit my bottom line and break my spirit by turning my own community against me. My public relations manager suggested we immediately release a statement or a counter video to defend my character and set the record straight about who actually funded Malik and his lifestyle. I looked at my team and told them absolutely not. I was not going to participate in a messy internet shouting match with a mistress. Fighting in the mud only gets you dirty, and it gives the pigs exactly what they want. I told my staff to accept every cancellation with a polite smile and process the refunds without a single word of complaint. Let the church ladies leave because I knew they would be begging to come back once the real truth came out. I did not need to defend myself online because my retaliation was not going to be a social media post. My retaliation was going to be structural and absolute. I dismissed the lawyers and asked my senior auditor to stay behind in the boardroom. We opened the master ledger for my holding company and started digging through the extensive list of benefits and perks I had been funding for the past 7 years. When you build a successful business, it is easy to put things on autopay and forget about them. I had generously placed Malik and his extended family on my premium corporate health insurance plan years ago. I looked at the billing statements and felt a cold smile form on my face. I was paying for Ruby and her expensive blood pressure medications. I was paying for Ebony and Wyatt to have top-tier dental and vision coverage because Wyatt was too cheap to buy a decent plan through his own brokerage firm. And worst of all, I saw that Malik had recently upgraded his coverage to include an elite maternity and delivery package. He was using my money from my company to pay for the prenatal care of his mistress and the twin babies she was carrying. I looked at my auditor and told him we were doing a massive cleanup of the corporate accounts right now. I instructed him to log into the benefits portal and terminate every single dependent listed under my name. He asked if I wanted to wait until the end of the billing cycle at the end of the month. I told him to cancel everything immediately effective today at noon. I watched as he clicked the buttons and removed Ruby from the pharmacy benefits plan. I watched as he erased Ebony and Wyatt from the coverage network. And I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he officially terminated the elite maternity package that was supposed to cover Chantel and her private hospital room for the delivery. They wanted to play games with my operating accounts and call me a terrible wife on the internet. Now they were going to find out exactly how cold and ruthless I could be when the financial safety net was completely ripped out from under them. I knew the exact moment the cancellations took effect because the consequences were instantaneous. Later that afternoon, Ruby went to the luxury pharmacy in Buckhead to pick up her customized compound medications. My security team reported that she caused a massive scene screaming at the pharmacist when her card was declined, and she was asked to pay $400 out of pocket. She tried to use the joint credit card, which I had already deactivated, resulting in a deeply embarrassing moment in front of her fellow church members who were waiting in line. Ebony and Wyatt were turned away from a scheduled appointment at a high-end dental clinic when the receptionist informed them their insurance policy no longer existed. But the most satisfying consequence belonged to Chantel. She had an appointment with one of the most exclusive and expensive obstetricians in Atlanta. When she arrived to check on the twins, the billing department informed her that her premium corporate coverage had been abruptly canceled and she would need to provide a cash retainer of $10,000 to continue her prenatal care at their facility. Malik could not help her because his accounts were frozen by the very same lawsuit he had initiated against me. They had trapped themselves in a financial cage of their own making, and they were just beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake. I sat alone in my office as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the Atlanta skyline. The building was quiet now, and the chaos of the day had finally settled into a manageable hum. I was reviewing the countersuit documents when my personal cell phone began to ring. It was not the business line. It was the private number I only gave to close associates and medical professionals. I looked at the screen and saw an unknown caller ID from a neighboring area code. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was a reporter trying to get a scoop on the social media drama, or perhaps Wyatt trying to beg for his insurance back. I answered the phone and simply said hello without giving my name. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to an older man. He sounded tired but professional. He asked if he was speaking to Harper, and I confirmed that he was. He introduced himself as Dr. Theodore Stanton. The name did not immediately register until he mentioned the specific urology clinic he used to run on the outskirts of the city almost 2 decades ago. My breath caught in my throat. I had hired a private investigator to track down Malik and his childhood medical records, because something about his past had never made sense to me. Malik had always been incredibly evasive about his teenage medical history, and whenever we went to fertility specialists, he always found an excuse to avoid getting his own comprehensive testing done, placing the entirety of the blame and the painful procedures squarely on my shoulders. Dr. Stanton explained that he had officially retired 5 years ago, but he still retained access to the physical archives of his old clinic, which were scheduled to be digitized and destroyed by the end of the month. He said he received the subpoena and the authorization forms from my legal team, requesting the deep dive into Malik and his adolescent medical files. The doctor paused, and the silence on the line felt heavy with unspoken implications. He took a slow breath and told me that he remembered Malik very clearly because his case had been particularly severe and highly unusual. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, feeling the cool metal against my skin. I asked him if he had found the records and if they confirmed what I suspected. Dr. Stanton cleared his throat, and his next words changed the entire trajectory of the war I was fighting. He said he had the files sitting right in front of him on his desk. He verified the dates and the diagnosis from when Malik was just 12 years old. Then Dr. Stanton lowered his voice and asked me a question that sent a sudden electrifying chill straight down my spine. "The medical records you requested are all here," Dr. Stanton said, his tone incredibly serious. "But given the sensitive and absolute nature of this diagnosis, I have to ask you something before I send these over to your lawyers. Are you entirely sure you want to open this box?" I told Dr. Stanton that I was absolutely sure. I told him to send every single page of those medical records directly to my lead attorney via a secure courier service. When I ended the call, I sat in the gathering dusk of my office and let the magnitude of what I had just learned wash over me. The war was no longer just about money or real estate or bruised egos. It was about a fundamental lie that had shaped my entire marriage and the very existence of my husband's supposed new family. But I did not strike immediately. I was a software developer and a business owner, and I knew that the most devastating bugs are the ones you let run quietly in the background until the entire system is entirely dependent on them. So I locked the digital scans of the medical files in a secure vault, and I waited. 7 grueling months passed since that explosive anniversary dinner. The divorce proceedings became a muddy, endless trench war. Malik fought for every single penny, trying desperately to claim his imaginary half of my empire. His lawyers filed motion after motion trying to unfreeze accounts claiming financial hardship and demanding temporary spousal support for a man who had never paid a single utility bill with his own money. Meanwhile, Chantel carried her pregnancy like a royal mandate. She posted daily updates on her social media pages, rubbing her growing belly and writing long, preachy captions about the blessings of true love and the resilience of a growing family. She painted herself as a beautiful martyr who had rescued a good man from a cold, barren corporate wife. The women at Ruby's church ate it up. They sent organic casseroles and hand-knitted baby blankets while silently boycotting my wellness centers and whispering behind my back. Then the twins were finally born. 2 boys. It was the ultimate validation for Malik's fragile masculinity and Ruby's overbearing matriarchal pride. Because the divorce was still hotly disputed, and their financial resources were severely restricted by my legal injunctions, Ruby and Ebony decided they needed to make a grand public statement. They needed to prove to the entire community of Atlanta that they were not defeated and that their bloodline was victorious and thriving. So they planned a sip and see party. For those outside the southern social circles, a sip and see is a lavish gathering to introduce new babies to friends, family, and the wider community. But Ruby did not just want a simple, intimate gathering in a living room. She wanted a spectacle. She wanted ice sculptures, an imported champagne, and a live string quartet. She chose the Buckhead Country Club, which was arguably the most expensive and exclusive venue in the entire city. There was only one massive problem. Malik was completely broke. His accounts were still frozen and his credit score was utterly destroyed from the unpaid lawyer fees. Ruby was living in a cramped rental house on the outskirts of the city because I had successfully evicted her from the beautiful Decatur property months ago. They had absolutely no legitimate way to fund a high-end country club event. But Ebony, in her infinite arrogance, remembered something. Years ago, when I was first building the wellness centers, I had given Ebony a corporate credit card to handle small vendor purchases and daily spa supplies. I had deactivated her personal employee access long ago, but the primary account number remained active in the system for legacy corporate billing. Ebony had kept the card details written down in an old notebook. She and Ruby assumed that because my businesses generated so much revenue across multiple locations, I would never notice a single charge buried in the monthly operating expenses. They shamelessly used my corporate credit card number to secure the grand ballroom, and they charged an $80,000 deposit to cover the premium catering, the extravagant floral arrangements, the top-tier open bar, and the exorbitant venue fees. They genuinely thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they could celebrate their betrayal using the very money I had earned through my own blood and sweat. But my accounting department was immaculate, and our monitoring software was state-of-the-art. The massive fraud alert hit my desk within 48 hours of the transaction. My chief financial officer came to my office and asked if I wanted him to simply reverse the charge and cancel the card to avoid any hassle. I looked at the billing details and saw the country club venue, named the event date, and the specific catering notes requesting white roses and gold-accented baby bassinets. I told my financial officer to leave the charge pending and untouched. I did not want to stop the party from happening. I wanted them to enjoy the party right up to the absolute peak of their arrogance before I ripped the floor out from under them. Instead of calling the bank, I called the Financial Fraud Division of the Atlanta Police Department. I filed a formal report for identity theft and corporate fraud, providing the exact time and location where the stolen funds were going to be utilized by the perpetrators. The day of the sip, NC arrived. It was a beautiful, sunny Saturday afternoon in Atlanta. The Buckhead Country Club was dripping with wealth and old Southern charm. I dressed meticulously for the occasion. I chose a dark crimson tailored suit that fit me perfectly, pairing it with sharp black stiletto heels. I wanted to look like the executioner they never saw coming. I drove my Porsche to the country club and met two plainclothes financial fraud detectives in the parking lot. They were accompanied by the general manager of the club, who looked incredibly pale, sweating profusely and deeply nervous about the massive financial discrepancy happening under his prestigious roof. We walked through the grand double doors and approached the main ballroom. The sound of soft classical music from a live string quartet drifted down the long carpeted hallway. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the loud booming laughter of my soon-to-be ex-husband. The doors to the ballroom were wide open, and the scene inside was a masterclass in unearned luxury and delusion. There were massive arrangements of expensive white roses on every single table. Waiters in crisp tuxedos were passing around silver trays of caviar and smoked salmon on toasted blinis. A massive sparkling ice sculpture in the shape of a baby rattle dominated the center of the room, catching the light from the chandeliers. Ruby was holding court near the extravagant dessert table, wearing a large, ridiculous gold hat, accepting glowing compliments from the very same church ladies who had boycotted my business. Malik was standing near the mahogany bar with a lit cigar in his hand, puffing his chest out as he boasted to Wyatt and a group of other men about the superior strength of his genetics. And there was Chantel, sitting in a plush velvet chair like a queen, wearing a custom designer gown, holding the twin boys who were dressed in matching white silk outfits. They were living their absolute best life, completely oblivious to the fact that every single bite of food and drop of champagne was funded by a felony crime. I stepped into the ballroom with the two detectives and the general manager walking right behind me. I did not say a word, but my presence alone was enough to shift the atmospheric pressure in the room. The church ladies closest to the door stopped talking, their mouths dropping open as they noticed me standing there in my crimson suit. The tense silence spread like a virus across the ballroom until even the string quartet faltered, lost their rhythm and stopped playing altogether. The sudden awkward quiet caused Malik to turn around from the bar. The smug, confident smile on his face vanished the exact second he made eye contact with me. Ruby stepped forward, clutching her fake pearl necklace, her face contorting with immediate defensive rage. "What are you doing here, Harper?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing heavily in the silent room. "You were not invited to this celebration. You have no right to show your face and ruin this beautiful day for my family after everything you have done to us." I calmly walked toward the center of the room, the clicking of my heels sounding like a ticking clock counting down their demise. I did not address Ruby. I turned my attention to the general manager, who stepped forward nervously, adjusting his silk tie and clearing his throat. "Excuse me, everyone," the general manager said, his voice trembling slightly under the collective gaze of 100 wealthy guests. "I deeply apologize for this interruption, but there is a severe administrative issue regarding the funding of this event. The $80,000 payment used to secure this ballroom and the premium catering has been officially flagged as fraudulent, and the transaction has just been reversed by the issuing bank." A loud, collective gasp rippled through the well-dressed crowd. The church ladies began whispering frantically behind their hands, their eyes darting between me and Ruby. Ebony, who was standing near the melting ice sculpture, suddenly looked like she was going to throw up on the marble floor. She knew exactly what she had done, and she realized I had finally caught her in the act. Malik stepped forward aggressively, trying to salvage his pride in front of his wealthy friends. "What are you talking about?" he barked, looking at the manager with fake outrage. "The venue is fully paid for. You cannot just walk in here and embarrass my family like this in front of our guests." The two plainclothes detectives stepped forward, flanking the manager. They opened their jackets to display their gold police badges. "Actually, sir," one of the detectives said in a calm, authoritative voice, "the payment was made using a stolen corporate credit card number belonging to this lady right here." He gestured toward me. "That constitutes grand theft and corporate fraud under Georgia law. The management of this club has been incredibly accommodating by not immediately pressing charges and having the organizers arrested in handcuffs. However, the club requires immediate payment in full right now to cover the incurred costs." The manager nodded profusely, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yes, exactly. Sir, if you cannot provide $80,000 in cash or a certified wire transfer immediately, right this second, I have absolutely no choice but to demand that every single person leave these premises. The food service is immediately terminated. The bar is closed. If you do not vacate the property, we will have the police arrest the event organizers for theft of services and trespassing." The absolute panic that washed over the room was delicious to witness. Wyatt, the so-called superior white brother-in-law who always acted like he was vastly better than everyone else, immediately set his expensive bourbon down and tried to subtly slip out the side door, pretending he was entirely unaffiliated with the family. Chantel clutched the babies, looking around with wild, terrified eyes. She had desperately wanted a high society debut, and instead she was getting a highly public criminal eviction. Ruby was shaking visibly, her face turning a dangerous shade of dark purple. "Harper, you evil, vindictive woman," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You planned this just to humiliate us in front of the congregation." I looked at Ruby, my expression completely blank and devoid of any mercy. "I did not plan your daughter committing credit card fraud, Ruby. I simply refused to pay the bill for your delusions. You wanted a lavish lifestyle to show off to your friends. You should have figured out how to actually afford it." Malik was frantically pulling out his cell phone, desperately trying to open banking apps that were completely frozen and drained. "I do not have it," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his public destruction. "I do not have the money to cover this right now." The manager clapped his hands together, looking at the confused and horrified guests who were already backing away. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so sorry, but this event is officially canceled. Please make your way to the exits immediately. It was a stampede of extreme social embarrassment. The church ladies grabbed their designer purses and practically ran for the heavy oak doors, desperate to avoid being associated with a police raid or a fraud investigation. The waiters began snatching plates of food right out of people's hands without apologizing. The string quartet packed up their instruments in record time and fled the scene. Within 10 minutes, the grand, beautiful ballroom was completely empty, except for the discarded cocktail napkins and the rapidly melting baby rattle ice sculpture. The ultimate humiliation was complete. Malik, Chantel, Ruby, and Ebony were escorted out the back service exit by the detectives, while I simply turned around and walked back to my car feeling lighter than air. The contrast between their grand expectations and their harsh new reality could not have been more severe. With no money, no venue, and nowhere else to go, the family was forced to retreat to Ruby's cramped, run-down rental house on the very edge of town. The atmosphere inside the small, sagging house was suffocating and miserable. The air conditioning was barely working, and the house smelled strongly of old cooking oil and deep despair. The beautiful, expensive white silk outfits the twins were wearing looked completely ridiculous in the dim, dingy lighting of Ruby's cluttered living room. Malik was pacing the worn-out carpet, cursing loudly and kicking the cheap furniture, while Ebony cried hysterically in the corner, terrified that the detectives were going to show up with a warrant and send her to jail for fraud. Chantel was sitting on a sagging sofa, exhausted and overwhelmed by the sheer catastrophic disaster of the day. One of the twins began to cry, a high-pitched wailing sound that grated on everyone's already severely frayed nerves. "I will change him," Ruby muttered angrily, snatching the crying baby from Chantel's arms. She needed an excuse to get away from the relentless arguing in the living room. She carried the fussy infant down the narrow hallway and into the small, cramped bedroom she used as a makeshift nursery. Ruby laid the baby down on the cheap plastic changing table. The room was very poorly lit, with only a single dusty lamp casting long shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper. She unfastened the matching white silk onesie, pulling the soft fabric down to expose the baby's skin. She reached for a fresh diaper from the stack, but as she looked down, her hand froze completely in midair. She stared at the baby's lower back. There was a strange, very distinct birthmark right above the left hip. It was a cluster of pale, irregular spots that formed a unique shape. Ruby's breath caught sharply in her throat. Her mind raced back 24 years to a sterile hospital room when Malik was just 12 years old, suffering from a severe, life-threatening complication of the mumps. She remembered the doctor pulling her aside, showing her the test results explaining the permanent, irreversible damage to Malik's reproductive system. She remembered the absolute certainty of the doctor's voice when he told her that Malik was 100% sterile and would never be able to father children naturally. She had buried that painful secret deep in her soul to protect her son's fragile pride. She had convinced herself that maybe the doctors were somehow wrong, or a miracle had happened when Chantel suddenly got pregnant. But looking at this baby right now, looking at the skin tone that was significantly lighter than the other twin, looking at the facial features that suddenly seemed strikingly Caucasian, a horrifying realization washed over her. The puzzle pieces snapped into place, forming a picture so disturbing it made her physically sick to her stomach. Ruby stood frozen, her face completely draining of color as her entire worldview shattered. The silence in the small bedroom was deafening, broken only by the soft cooing of the infant on the table. She slowly turned her head toward the doorway, where Chantel had just appeared holding a bottle of warm formula. Ruby looked at Chantel, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of shock and revulsion. Her voice trembled uncontrollably as she pointed a shaking finger at the baby lying on the table. "This child," Ruby whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own shattering reality. "You still have not told him, Chantel." The air inside the small, cramped nursery felt suffocatingly hot as Ruby locked the hollow wooden door behind her, leaving the sounds of Malik cursing and Ebony crying out in the living room. Ruby did not move a single muscle as she stared at the pale infant, lying on the cheap plastic changing table. The silence in the room became thick and pressing, wrapping around the two women like a physical weight. Chantel froze by the door, her fingers gripping the warm plastic of the baby bottle so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. The elaborate web of lies Chantel had spun to secure a permanent place in high society was unraveling in the most catastrophic way possible right in front of her eyes. Ruby kept her burning gaze locked on Chantel, letting the horrifying reality of the situation fill the space between them. "You knew," Ruby said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, mechanical whisper. "You knew my son could not give you a child. You knew he was sterile, and yet you stood in my house and let us throw a party celebrating his legacy. Whose children are these, Chantel?" Chantel took a trembling step backward, her eyes darting toward the locked door like a trapped animal calculating a desperate escape route. She shook her head, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "I do not know what you are talking about," she stammered, her voice breaking with rising panic. "Those are Malik's boys. They are his blood. You are just upset about the police at the country club and you are taking it out on me." Ruby crossed the small room in two massive strides. She grabbed Chantel by the collar of her oversized beige sweater and slammed her hard against the closed bedroom door. The sudden violence made Chantel drop the baby bottle. It hit the cheap linoleum floor with a dull thud, spilling warm white formula across the ground. The second baby, resting in a nearby bassinet, began to wail, joining the cries of the pale baby on the table. Ruby did not care about the noise. She pressed her forearm against Chantel's collarbone, pinning her against the wood. "Do not you ever lie to me again?" Ruby hissed, her face inches from Chantel's terrified eyes. "I was in the hospital room 24 years ago when the doctors told me my son had a severe complication from the mumps. I was there when they told me he would never produce a child. I kept that secret to protect his pride as a man. I let you play your little games because I thought maybe a miracle had happened. But I am looking at this baby, Chantel. I am looking at a child with pale skin and features that do not belong anywhere in my family tree. I am going to ask you one more time before I drag you into the living room and let Malik tear you apart. Whose babies are these?" Chantel began to sob uncontrollably, the fake tears from her internet videos replaced by genuine visceral terror. She realized the game was completely over. She gasped for air, clutching at Ruby's arm, trying to relieve the pressure on her chest. "Please, Ruby, please do not tell him," Chantel begged, her voice breaking into pathetic whimpers. "I can explain everything. Just let me go, and I will tell you the truth." Ruby slowly released her grip, but she did not step back. She stood like a stone wall, blocking the only exit from the room. She folded her arms across her chest and waited. The two infants continued to cry, their wails echoing off the peeling floral wallpaper, but neither woman moved to comfort them. The room was entirely consumed by the gravity of the confession that was about to happen. "It was supposed to be easy." Chantel started, her voice shaking as she wiped her tear-streaked face. "Malik was so desperate to be a father. He complained all the time about Harper and how she could not give him a family. He told me he would leave her if he could just find a woman who could give him a legacy. I knew about Harper's money, Ruby. Everyone knew Harper was the one funding everything. I thought if I could just get pregnant, Malik would divorce Harper and take half of her massive business empire. I thought we would be rich. I thought I would finally have the life I deserved." Ruby stared at her, feeling a sickening mixture of disgust and dark recognition. Chantel was just a younger, more desperate version of herself trying to manipulate her way into wealth. But how Ruby demanded, "If Malik is sterile, how did you get pregnant?" Chantel looked down at the spilled formula on the floor, unable to meet Ruby's burning gaze. "I went to a clinic," Chantel whispered. "I used some of the money Malik gave me from Harper's accounts to visit a private fertility center. I selected an anonymous donor, someone who matched Malik's general physical profile. I scheduled the insemination during the same week Malik and I went on a romantic weekend getaway. I planned it perfectly so the timeline would match. I just wanted to give him what he wanted so he would claim me and I could get access to the fortune." Ruby felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. The pure deception was staggering. Chantel had artificially inseminated herself just to trap Malik and steal Harper's money. It was a ruthless, calculated scheme that had completely destroyed their lives. But Ruby's mind was still fixated on the pale infant lying on the changing table. She looked at the baby, and then looked back at Chantel. A terrible dark suspicion clawing at the edges of her mind. "That explains one baby," Ruby said, her voice dangerously calm. "That explains the donor. But twins do not look completely different unless something else happened. That baby on the table has distinct Caucasian features, Chantel. He has light eyes and pale skin. An anonymous black donor does not produce a child that looks like that. So you are going to tell me exactly what else you did during that week." Chantel squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body trembling as the ultimate rot at the center of her life was finally exposed. She let out a pathetic broken sob, covering her face with her hands. "It is a medical anomaly," Chantel cried, her voice muffled by her fingers. The doctors called it heteropaternal superfecundation. It happens when two different eggs are fertilized by two different men during the same ovulation cycle. It is incredibly rare, Ruby. I swear I did not plan for it to happen. Ruby's heart stopped completely. The medical terminology meant nothing to her, but the implications struck her like a physical blow. Two different men, two different fathers for the twins. She stared at the pale baby on the table, and suddenly the features did not just look Caucasian. They looked familiar. They looked horribly, agonizingly familiar. The shape of the jaw, the slight curve of the nose, the arrogant tilt of the brow that was already visible in the infant's small face. Ruby felt the air leave her lungs. She grabbed Chantel by the shoulders and shook her violently. "Who?" Chantel Ruby screamed, keeping her voice just low enough that the men in the living room could not hear. "Who is the other father? Tell me right now before I end your life." Chantel collapsed to her knees, her oversized sweater pooling around her on the dirty floor. She looked up at Ruby with absolute defeat. It was Wyatt. Chantel choked out the name hanging in the air like toxic poison. It was Wyatt, Ruby. "It happened the day before I went to the clinic. Ebony was out of town at a real estate seminar, and Wyatt came over to my apartment to help me fix a leaking sink. We had a few drinks and things just got out of control. It only happened once, I swear. I never thought I would get pregnant from him. I never thought both eggs would take." Ruby stumbled backward, hitting the wall. Her legs suddenly felt like lead. The room began to spin, and a loud ringing noise filled her ears. Wyatt, Ebony's husband. The condescending, arrogant white insurance broker who looked down his nose at their entire family. The man who sat at their dinner tables passing quiet judgment while secretly sleeping with his brother-in-law's mistress. Wyatt had impregnated Chantel at the exact same time she was using a donor to trap Malik. The twin boys lying in this dark, miserable room were half-brothers with completely different fathers, and neither of those fathers was her son. The absolute depravity of the situation threatened to crush Ruby's mind. If this truth got out, it would not just be an embarrassment. It would be an apocalyptic destruction of her entire bloodline. Ebony would be destroyed, realizing her husband had defiled their marriage with her brother's mistress. Malik would completely lose his mind, discovering his entire grand legacy was a fraudulent lie built on donor sperm and his own brother-in-law's betrayal. The church community would feast on this scandal for decades. They would be the laughingstock of the entire city of Atlanta. Harper would be vindicated completely and totally, while Ruby's family burned in the ashes of their own toxic creation. Ruby looked down at Chantel, who was still weeping pathetically on the floor. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to kick her, to drag her out of the room by her hair and throw her onto the street. But the survival instinct that had kept Ruby alive all these years suddenly engaged, taking over her rational mind. She could not expose Chantel. She could not let Malik or Ebony know the truth. The family honor, the illusion of their superiority, was the only thing they had left. If they lost that, they had absolutely nothing. Ruby took a deep, shuddering breath and forced her heart to slow down. She reached down and grabbed Chantel by the arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. Chantel flinched, expecting a blow, but Ruby just stared at her with dead empty eyes. "You are going to listen to me very carefully," Ruby said, her voice stripped of all emotion. "You are going to wipe your face, and you are going to pick up that bottle. We are going to walk out of this room, and we are going to act like nothing happened. These babies belong to Malik. Do you understand me? These babies are Malik's blood, and no one will ever say otherwise. You will take this filthy, disgusting secret to your grave, Chantel. If you ever breathe a single word of this to Malik, to Ebony, or to anyone else, I will personally make sure you never see these children again." Chantel nodded frantically, tears still spilling down her cheeks. "I promise, Ruby. I promise I will never say anything. I just want Malik to love me." Ruby felt a wave of intense disgust, but she forced herself to nod. "Good," she said, turning away from the younger woman. "Now fix the babies. They are crying." Ruby unlocked the bedroom door and stepped out into the narrow hallway, pulling the door shut behind her. The living room was still a zone of absolute despair. Malik was sitting on the couch, his head buried in his hands, completely defeated by the reality of his frozen bank accounts and his public humiliation at the country club. Ebony was sitting next to him, staring blankly at the wall, her makeup running down her cheeks. Wyatt was pacing near the front window, looking nervously at his phone, clearly terrified that his own financial involvement with the fraudulent credit card was going to destroy his insurance career. Ruby looked at the three of them, her children and the man who had secretly defiled their family. She felt a surge of physical sickness, but she swallowed it down, burying it beneath a thick layer of desperate determination. They were completely broke. They were facing potential criminal charges for the $80,000 country club fraud. They had no resources and no allies left in the city. There was only one person who could fix this massive catastrophe. There was only one person who had the power, the money, and the influence to make the police go away and save them from absolute ruin. Ruby walked into the kitchen and grabbed her car keys off the counter. Malik looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and filled with panic. "Where are you going, Mama?" he asked, his voice trembling like a frightened child. "I am going to fix this," Ruby said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I am going to clean up the mess you made. Stay here and do not talk to anyone." She walked out the front door and stepped into the humid Atlanta evening. The sky had turned a dark, bruised purple, and heavy gray clouds were rolling in from the west. The air smelled like ozone and wet asphalt, signaling the arrival of a massive summer thunderstorm. Ruby climbed into her car, ignoring the first fat drops of rain that began to fall against the windshield. She started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her hands ached. As she drove through the darkening streets, the rain began to fall in heavy, violent sheets, washing over the city and turning the roads into slick, black rivers. The windshield wipers worked frantically, but they could barely keep up with the deluge. Ruby stared straight ahead, her mind racing with a desperate, cowardly plan. She had spent the last 7 years treating Harper like an irrelevant piece of machinery. She had insulted her, belittled her, and actively supported the mistress who was currently sitting in her living room. But now, stripped of her pride and terrified of the horrifying secrets threatening to destroy her children, Ruby had to do the unthinkable. She had to swallow every ounce of her arrogant ego and crawl back to the woman she had tried to destroy. She needed Harper's money to pay off the country club debt and stop the criminal investigation. She needed Harper to drop the eviction and unfreeze the corporate accounts before Wyatt and Malik were sent to federal prison. She was willing to offer anything, to beg, to plead, to make any sick compromise necessary to save her family from total annihilation. The drive took over an hour in the blinding storm, but finally Ruby turned onto the exclusive private road leading to Harper's primary estate. The massive wrought iron gates loomed in the darkness, rain pouring down the intricate metalwork. Ruby pulled her car up to the call box, rolling down her window and letting the freezing rain soak her expensive clothes and ruin her carefully styled hair. She pressed the intercom button, shivering in the cold storm, waiting for the connection. She did not care how pathetic she looked. She did not care how much dignity she had to surrender. She stared at the glowing red light on the call box, her heart pounding with raw, absolute desperation as she prepared to offer her daughter-in-law the ultimate cowardly compromise. I watched the glowing red light of the security monitor in my study as the rain pounded against the thick glass of my windows. The storm outside was violent and unforgiving, stripping the leaves from the trees and turning the long, winding driveway of my estate into a river of dark, rushing water. On the high-definition screen, I could see Ruby sitting in her car at the front gate. The same woman who had marched into my office yesterday demanding my submission was now reduced to a blurry figure pressing the intercom button over and over again. She had rolled her window down, and the relentless downpour was soaking the interior of her vehicle and ruining her expensive clothes. I sat in my comfortable leather chair holding a warm cup of herbal tea and simply watched her panic. Part of me wanted to leave her out there all night to let the cold and the wet slowly wash away the decades of arrogance she wore like a second skin. But another part of me, the part that had survived 7 years of her emotional abuse, wanted to see the exact look on her face when she finally broke. I reached out and pressed the button to open the main gates. The heavy iron gates slowly swung open, groaning slightly against the fierce wind. Ruby did not hesitate. She drove her car up the long driveway, parking haphazardly near the front steps. She practically fell out of the driver's seat, not even bothering to grab an umbrella. The rain instantly plastered her hair to her skull and soaked her clothes so thoroughly that she looked small and fragile. I walked out of my study and moved slowly toward the grand foyer of my home. The marble floors were heated beneath my bare feet, and the air smelled of cedar and expensive candles. It was a sanctuary of wealth and peace that Malik and his family had taken for granted every single time they stepped inside. I opened the massive, solid oak front door just as Ruby reached the top of the porch steps. She stopped dead in her tracks, shivering violently, water streaming down her face and dripping from her chin. She looked absolutely pathetic, but I felt no pity. I stood in the doorway, blocking her path into the warmth of my home. I did not step aside, and I did not offer her a towel. "Harper, please," Ruby said, her voice shaking from the cold and the sheer humiliation of the moment. "Let me come inside. We need to talk." "You can speak from exactly where you are, Ruby," I replied, my voice calm and completely devoid of warmth. "You are not welcome inside my home ever again. State your business or I am closing this door." Ruby wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as the freezing rain continued to blow onto the covered porch. She looked down at the welcome mat, taking a deep, shuddering breath as she desperately tried to gather whatever fragments of her pride remained. She looked back up at me, and her face morphed into an expression of exaggerated sorrow and maternal concern. She was shifting tactics, abandoning the aggressive matriarch routine and attempting to play the role of the wise, sympathetic elder. "Harper, we are both strong black women," Ruby began, her teeth chattering slightly. "We both know how hard this world is and how much we have to carry on our shoulders. I know you are hurting. I know my son broke your heart and disrespected your marriage. What Chantel did was wrong, and I am not here to defend their terrible choices. I am here as a mother talking to a daughter. I am here woman to woman to ask you to end this war before it destroys all of us." I watched her perform this monologue with a sense of clinical fascination. It was incredible how easily she could weave a web of lies and false empathy when her own survival was on the line. She was acting as if she had not been standing in my office just hours ago, demanding I fund her grandchildren and let her son's mistress move into my property. "What exactly do you want, Ruby?" I asked, leaning against the heavy wooden doorframe. Ruby swallowed hard, stepping slightly closer to the door but staying out of my reach. "I want you to drop the eviction on the Decatur house," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I want you to unfreeze the corporate accounts and call off the financial fraud detectives. Malik is facing absolute ruin, Harper. Wyatt could lose his entire insurance brokerage if those charges go through. And Ebony is terrified. We have nothing left. I am asking you to just let Malik walk away. Let him sign the divorce papers peacefully without asking for alimony or trying to take your businesses. If you just unfreeze the money and drop the charges, he will walk out of your life forever, and you will never have to see any of us again. Please, Harper, for the sake of the love you once had for this family, just let us go in peace." She stood there in the pouring rain, waiting for my response, expecting her desperate woman manipulation to somehow appeal to my softer side. She thought my silence was a sign of hesitation. She thought I was actually considering her pathetic offer to let Malik escape his own consequences. I looked at her drenched, shivering form, and a slow, genuine laugh escaped my lips. It started low in my chest and grew until it echoed through the grand foyer of my home. It was not a bitter laugh or an angry laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had finally seen through the ultimate illusion. Ruby stared at me, her false expression of maternal sorrow slipping away to reveal pure confusion. "What is so funny?" she asked, her voice tightening with a mixture of fear and irritation. "You are offering me a peaceful divorce in exchange for saving your son from federal fraud charges," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You are begging me to drop the eviction and unfreeze my own money as if you hold any cards in this negotiation. You are standing on my porch in the pouring rain, trying to use our shared womanhood to manipulate me into saving your family from the consequences of their own toxic greed. It is truly hilarious, Ruby." "I am not manipulating you," Harper Ruby cried out, a flash of genuine anger returning to her eyes. "I am trying to save my family. I am trying to stop you from acting like a monster." "A monster!" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let me tell you about monsters, Ruby. Let me tell you about a Sunday morning exactly 4 years ago. You were hosting one of your lavish post-church brunches at your house. You demanded that I drive all the way across town to a specialty market to buy a very specific brand of imported English breakfast tea that you absolutely had to have for your guests. Do you remember that morning, Ruby?" Ruby's eyes darted away, her shivering seeming to worsen. "I do not know what you are talking about," she muttered defensively. "I am sure you do not." I continued, my voice sharp and cutting like glass. "But I remember it perfectly. There was a massive thunderstorm that morning, just like this one. I drove for 40 minutes in the blinding rain to get your special tea. But when I got back to your house and carried the bags up to your porch, you looked inside and saw that the store had given me the loose leaf version instead of the tea bags. You were so furious that I had ruined your perfect brunch. You told me I was useless. You told me I could not even execute a simple task. And then, Ruby, you locked the front door. You locked me outside on your porch in the freezing rain for 30 minutes while you went back to entertaining your friends. You made me stand there shivering and soaked to the bone because you wanted to teach me a lesson about respect." Ruby opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand, silencing her instantly. When Malik finally realized I was missing and opened the door to let me in, "You walked over with a cup of coffee in your hand," I said, my eyes burning into hers. "You looked at me dripping wet and freezing, and you told me something I have never forgotten. You said losers do not get to make demands in this family. You said if I wanted to be treated with respect, I needed to stop acting like a failure." The memory of that humiliation hung between us heavier than the rain falling around us. Ruby stared at me, her face completely pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find a way to spin the past to her advantage. But there was no escaping the truth of her own cruelty. "You started this game, Ruby," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "You and Malik and Chantel and Wyatt and Ebony. You all decided that I was nothing more than a bank account you could drain and discard. You thought you could freeze my assets and force me to surrender. But you were wrong. I am not negotiating with you. I am not unfreezing the accounts. I am not dropping the fraud charges against your son or your son-in-law. And I am certainly not stopping the eviction. You have exactly 29 days left to get out of my house." "Harper, please!" Ruby screamed, stepping forward and reaching out to grab the edge of the heavy wooden door. "You cannot do this. We will have nothing. We will be completely destroyed. Losers do not get to make demands." "Ruby," I whispered, leaning close to her terrified face. "You started this game, but I am ending it." I shoved her hand off the wood and slammed the massive oak door shut with a deafening crack. The sound echoed through the high ceilings of my foyer, a perfect punctuation mark to the end of a 7-year nightmare. I reached out and slid the heavy deadbolt into place, locking her out in the cold, unforgiving storm. I turned away from the door and walked back toward the warmth of my study, leaving Ruby to face the torrential rain and the absolute collapse of her empire alone. At the exact same time, miles away in a quiet, upscale suburban neighborhood, the rain was falling just as relentlessly on the perfectly manicured lawn of Ebony and Wyatt's sprawling brick house. The streetlights flickered in the storm, casting long, erratic shadows across the wet pavement. A plain white delivery van turned onto the street, its tires hissing against the flooded asphalt. The van pulled up to the curb in front of their large colonial-style home and parked with the engine still idling. A delivery driver wearing a dark rain jacket with the hood pulled low over his face stepped out of the vehicle. He reached into the passenger seat and grabbed a small rectangular package wrapped in generic brown packaging tape. There was no return address on the label. There was only the printed destination addressed specifically to Wyatt and Ebony. The driver hurried up the long, winding walkway, keeping his head down against the biting wind and the heavy sheets of rain. He reached the wide, covered porch, shaking the water from his jacket. He did not ring the doorbell. He did not knock on the ornate glass panels of the front door. He simply bent down and placed the small brown package directly in the center of the welcome mat, perfectly positioned so that anyone opening the door would immediately have to step over it. The driver turned around and hurried back to his van, driving away into the stormy night, leaving the package waiting silently in the shadows. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense and fraught with silent anxiety. Ebony was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television screen, her mind racing with the terrifying prospect of a criminal fraud investigation. Wyatt was pacing in his home office, desperately making phone calls to his legal contacts, trying to figure out how to distance himself from the stolen corporate credit card before his insurance license was permanently revoked. Neither of them had any idea what had transpired at Ruby's rundown rental house earlier that afternoon. They had absolutely no idea about the horrifying discovery Ruby had made while changing the pale infant's diaper. They only knew that their financial stability was currently hanging by a thread. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling against the windows and rattling the expensive shutters. The small brown package sat quietly on the front porch undisturbed and waiting for the morning light. Inside that unassuming cardboard box, tightly sealed in tamper-proof plastic wrapping, lay the absolute destruction of their marriage. The package contained 2 identical medical-grade DNA test kits. Nestled between the sterile cotton swabs and the return shipping envelopes was a single piece of high-quality stationery paper. The note was printed in simple, bold black ink. It did not contain threats or lengthy explanations. It simply offered a devastating truth that could no longer be contained by Ruby's desperate silence. The rain continued to beat down on the roof, washing the city clean as the ultimate secret waited patiently on the welcome mat, ready to blow the last remaining fragments of their toxic family into absolute oblivion. The reckoning had arrived, and there was nowhere left for any of them to hide. The morning after the storm brought a crisp, cold light to the city of Atlanta. The rain had washed the streets clean, but it could not wash away the absolute delusion of my soon-to-be ex-husband. I sat at my kitchen island, wrapping both hands around a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, staring at the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. I was not angry. I was simply fascinated by the sheer limitless capacity of male audacity. Malik had actually gone to the local media to plead his case to the public. He was sitting on the plush pastel sofa of a popular local morning talk show, looking directly into the camera with a perfectly crafted expression of deep sorrow. Chantel was sitting right beside him, holding the twin boys. She was wearing a modest, high-necked dress, trying desperately to look like a wholesome, devoted mother, but I could see the rigid tension in her shoulders and the dark circles of panic under her eyes. She knew what Ruby had figured out in that cramped nursery, but Malik was completely and blissfully ignorant. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater designed to make him look approachable and entirely harmless. The host, a sympathetic local anchor, leaned forward and asked Malik how he was coping with the sudden freezing of his assets. Malik let out a heavy, practiced sigh and looked down at his hands. "It is a nightmare," he told the interviewer, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "I spent 11 years building a life with a woman I loved. But the moment I decided to follow my heart and build a real family, she turned into someone I do not even recognize. She used her high-priced lawyers to freeze every single penny I have. She is trying to starve us out. She is trying to punish my innocent children just because she is a bitter, barren woman who could never give me a family of my own." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter liquid slide down my throat. He was calling me bitter and barren on live television. He was sitting there rubbing Chantel's back, presenting himself as the ultimate victim of corporate greed and female vindictiveness. He claimed he was just a simple, loving family man, trying to protect his newborn sons from a cruel and wealthy tyrant. The audience in the studio was murmuring with sympathy. The host was nodding with a tragic expression, asking how the community could support them during this terrible legal battle. Malik even had the absolute nerve to look at the camera and ask for privacy while he fought for his rightful half of the business empire we supposedly built together. It was a masterful performance of pure, unadulterated delusion. Malik had no idea that his mother had spent the previous night shivering in the freezing rain on my front porch, begging for a cowardly compromise. He had no idea that Ruby was currently keeping the most toxic, radioactive secret in the history of our family simply to protect their fragile social standing. And most importantly, Malik had absolutely no idea that he was sitting on national television claiming fatherhood over two children that did not share a single drop of his DNA. He was building a massive public pedestal for himself, completely unaware that the foundation was made of rotting wood and lies. I turned off the television, leaving the screen black and silent. I did not feel an ounce of the humiliation he intended for me to feel. Instead, I felt the cold, sharp thrill of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a carefully laid trap. The higher Malik climbed on his tower of public sympathy, the more devastating his fall was going to be. I put my coffee mug in the sink, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked out the door. It was time to finalize the execution. I drove my Porsche through the busy morning traffic, heading straight toward the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed my legal team. My lead attorney, Marcus Stanton, was waiting for me in the main conference room. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of legal strategy and imminent destruction. The long mahogany table was covered in neat, meticulously organized stacks of manila folders, financial printouts, and court filings. The war room was fully prepped. Stanton stood at the head of the table wearing a sharp navy suit. He did not offer small talk. We had moved far beyond pleasantries. He pushed a thick red folder across the polished wood toward me. "We got it," Stanton said, his voice vibrating with professional satisfaction. "The hospital archives finally processed the subpoena. It took a federal court order and a mountain of legal pressure to unseal records this old, but we secured the complete medical file." I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, opening the red folder. Inside were dozens of yellowed, scanned pages from a pediatric hospital admitting department dated exactly 24 years ago. The medical terminology was dense and clinical, but the conclusion was absolutely undeniable. Malik had been admitted to the hospital at age 12 with a severe, life-threatening complication from a mumps infection. The condition had caused bilateral testicular atrophy. I read the final page where the attending specialist had signed his name beneath a definitive summary. The damage was permanent and irreversible. The patient had 0 sperm count. The medical assessment clearly stated that Malik was 100% sterile and would never be capable of biological reproduction. I traced my finger over the authenticated hospital seal at the bottom of the page. This was the ghost that Ruby had hidden in the dark for over 2 decades. This was the dirty little secret she had buried deep in her soul to protect her precious son's fragile masculinity. She had allowed me to spend years weeping in sterile fertility clinics, letting doctors poke and prod my body, enduring countless painful injections and devastating emotional crashes, all while knowing her son was shooting blanks. She had watched me blame my own body for our empty nursery, while Malik paraded around acting like a virile king. We had an independent medical expert review and authenticate the files. Stanton continued leaning against the edge of the table. There is absolutely no margin for error, Harper. Malik is completely sterile. He has been sterile since he was a child. He could not father a child if his life depended on it, which means the entire premise of his current legal strategy, his claim for emergency spousal support to provide for his biological heirs, is built on a massive verifiable fraud. I closed the red folder and looked up at Stanton. Malik is on the morning news right now, I said, my voice dangerously calm. He is doing exclusive interviews claiming I am trying to starve his innocent biological children. He is using his status as a new father to sway the court of public opinion and pressure the judge to lift the injunction on my accounts. Stanton smiled a cold, predatory grin that matched my own. Then let him talk, Stanton replied. Let him do every interview he can book. Let him submit sworn affidavits to the family court claiming those boys are his blood. Every single time he opens his mouth, he commits perjury. When we walk into that courtroom next week, we are not just going to dispute his claim to your business empire. We are going to present this medical record as Exhibit A. We are going to force him to take a court-ordered paternity test. The judge is going to watch a man who just spent weeks claiming to be an oppressed father suddenly realize he is nothing more than a biological dead end. The sheer magnitude of the impending destruction was almost intoxicating. I had spent my entire marriage playing by their rules, trying to be the perfect submissive wife, trying to ignore the constant disrespect and financial draining. But this was my arena now. I had the absolute truth, bound in red leather and certified by a federal judge. Malik thought he was a master manipulator, but he was just a pawn playing on a board he did not even understand. We spent the next 4 hours finalizing the exhibits. We organized the financial records proving Chantel had used stolen corporate funds to pay for the secret trips to the fertility clinic. We highlighted every single fraudulent charge Ruby and Ebony had run through my business accounts. We built a fortress of evidence so dense and impenetrable that no lawyer in the state of Georgia would be able to save them. By the time I left the law office, the sun was high in the sky and the trap was perfectly set. While I was securing my absolute victory in the sterile boardroom of a downtown skyscraper, a very different kind of reckoning was quietly unfolding miles away in the affluent suburbs. The morning air was thick with humidity as the storm clouds from the previous night finally broke apart, leaving the sky a pale washed-out blue. Ebony walked down the carpeted stairs of her sprawling brick home, wrapping a silk robe tightly around her waist. The house was entirely silent. Wyatt had left early for his insurance brokerage, mumbling something about crisis management and damage control regarding the country club incident. Ebony felt a nagging ache behind her eyes, a residual hangover from the stress and the crying of the past 2 days. She walked into the massive chef kitchen and poured herself a glass of cold water, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Their social standing was crumbling. The police were asking questions, and the threat of my lawyers loomed over them like a dark shadow. She walked toward the front door to check the mail, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor. She unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open, stepping out onto the covered porch. The damp morning air rushed over her skin. She looked down and saw a small rectangular package wrapped in brown paper sitting squarely in the middle of the welcome mat. The cardboard was slightly soft from the dampness of the previous night's storm, but the printed label was perfectly legible. It was addressed directly to her and Wyatt. There was no return address. There was no postage stamp, Someone had bypassed their neighborhood security and placed it there by hand. Ebony frowned, setting her glass of water on a small patio table. She bent down and picked up the box. It was surprisingly light. A strange prickle of anxiety ran down her arms. She carried the package back inside, shutting and locking the front door behind her. She walked to the kitchen island and grabbed a small paring knife from the wooden block, using the sharp blade to slice through the heavy packaging tape. She pulled the cardboard flaps back and peered inside. The box contained two identical slender boxes. They were medical-grade home DNA test kits, complete with sterile cotton swabs and prepaid shipping envelopes. Ebony stared at the colorful packaging, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She could not understand why someone would anonymously deliver DNA test kits to her front porch. Neither she nor Wyatt had ordered anything like this. She reached into the box to pull the kits out and noticed a single piece of high-quality white stationery folded neatly at the bottom. The paper felt thick and expensive between her fingers. She unfolded it slowly, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. The message was printed in sharp, bold black ink centered perfectly on the page. Ebony read the words once, and then she read them again, her mind struggling to process the arrangement of the letters. The breath caught violently in her throat, and the ambient noise of the refrigerator humming behind her seemed to fade into absolute silence. The paper shook in her trembling hands. If you want to know why one of Malik's twins has pale skin and light eyes, ask Chantel exactly what happened when she called Wyatt to fix her leaking sink. The proof is in the DNA. Do not let them lie to you anymore. Ebony's entire world stopped spinning. The words burned into her retinas. She stared at the black ink, feeling a sudden wave of extreme nausea crash over her. Wyatt and Chantel and the pale baby. The pieces of the puzzle that she had been too blind and too arrogant to see suddenly slammed together with sickening clarity. She remembered the afternoon Chantel had called complaining about a broken pipe in her kitchen. She remembered Wyatt offering to go over and take a look, playing the role of the helpful, sophisticated brother-in-law. She remembered how long it took him to get back home, and how he had immediately taken a shower, claiming he was covered in dirty water from the sink. Ebony dropped the paper onto the granite countertop, as if it had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the island to keep her legs from collapsing. Her mind raced back to the humiliating sip and sea party at the Buckhead Country Club. She pictured Chantel sitting in the velvet chair holding the twin boys. She pictured the second baby, the one Ruby had snatched up when it started crying. She remembered seeing the infants face the shocking contrast in skin tone, the shape of the eyes that did not look anything like Malik or Chantel. The pale skin and the light eyes. Take a good look at your new nephew's face. A ragged, choked sob tore itself from Ebony's throat. The realization was a physical agony tearing through her chest and suffocating her. Her husband, the man who constantly preached about superiority and class, the man who looked down on her own brother for his infidelity, had been secretly sleeping with Chantel. Wyatt had defiled their marriage bed with the very same woman who was tearing their family apart. And he had gotten her pregnant. The baby was not her nephew. The baby was her husband's illegitimate mixed-race child, born right alongside the child of an anonymous sperm donor. The depth of the betrayal was bottomless. Her entire perfect suburban life, her country club membership, her carefully curated social media image, everything was built on a foundation of absolute filthy lies. Ebony looked down at the DNA kits sitting innocently inside the brown cardboard box. The anonymous sender knew everything. Someone out there held the key to her total destruction, and they had just handed her the weapon to detonate her own life. The cold, calculated reality of the situation washed over her, drowning out the panic and replacing it with a burning, blinding rage. She grabbed her cell phone from the counter, her hands shaking violently as she scrolled through her contacts and pressed Wyatt's name. She listened to the dial tone ring echoing through the empty, silent house, waiting for her husband to answer so she could watch him burn. The morning of the divorce mediation arrived with a suffocating humidity that matched the heavy tension in the air. We were seated in a massive sterile conference room on the 30th floor of the downtown courthouse. I sat perfectly still next to my lead attorney, Marcus Stanton, keeping my posture rigid and my face completely unreadable. Across the long, polished mahogany table sat Malik, looking like a man who had already conquered the world. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit that I had paid for, and he sat leaning back in his leather chair with a sickeningly confident smirk. Right behind him, sitting in a row of spectator chairs, were Ruby and Chantel. Chantel was holding one of the twins wrapped tightly in a pale blue blanket, putting on her absolute best performance of a fragile, exhausted new mother who just needed support. And leaning against the back wall, standing like a silent, stoic guardian of the family honor, was Wyatt. He was playing the role of the supportive white brother-in-law, projecting an aura of calm superiority, completely unaware of the explosive bomb currently ticking under his own feet. The mediator, a stern, older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a deeply weary expression, asked Malik's attorney to state their opening demands. The lawyer was a ruthless bulldog known in Atlanta for dragging out messy, high-net-worth divorces, and he absolutely did not hold back. He demanded full ownership of two of my most profitable wellness centers, arguing that Malik was instrumental in their early conceptualization. He demanded a staggering $50,000 a month in permanent alimony. He spun a ridiculous, tragic narrative for the mediator, explaining how Malik had heroically sacrificed his own entrepreneurial dreams to support my demanding corporate career. The lawyer claimed that now, as a dedicated new father, Malik desperately needed the financial stability to provide for the next generation of his family. Malik nodded solemnly during the speech, actually wiping a fake tear from his eye as his lawyer described the immense financial burden of raising newborn twins as a single father. Ruby murmured her agreement from the back row, crossing her arms and glaring at me with supreme arrogance. They really thought they had me backed into an inescapable corner. They thought the physical presence of those babies was an unbreakable emotional and legal leverage that would force me to surrender my wealth. I did not interrupt them, and neither did Stanton. We sat in perfect silence and let them build their beautiful, fragile house of cards all the way to the very top. I watched Malik soak in the mediator's sympathetic nods, enjoying his brief moment of playing the ultimate martyr. When Malik's lawyer finally finished his dramatic 45-minute speech, the mediator turned his attention to us and asked for our formal response. Stanton did not say a single word. He simply reached into his slim leather briefcase, pulled out the authenticated red folder, and slid it smoothly across the polished wooden table. The heavy file came to a stop right in front of Malik and his attorney. Malik frowned, looking down at the official hospital seal stamped on the cover. "What is this nonsense?" he asked, his voice dripping with intense condescension. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold table, and looked dead into his arrogant eyes. "You are not getting child support, Malik," I said, my voice echoing cleanly and sharply in the quiet room. "You are not getting the spas, and you are not getting a single dime of my money to raise those children." Malik's attorney scoffed loudly, opening the folder with an exaggerated sigh. "You cannot simply refuse to support my client's legal dependents," he started to say, but his voice trailed off instantly as his eyes scanned the highlighted medical text on the first page. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Malik, watching the smugness slowly drain from his face as the silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and toxic. "You have been completely sterile since you were 12 years old, Malik," I stated, watching his pupils dilate in sudden, absolute shock. "The severe mumps infection you had caused irreversible damage. You have a 0 sperm count. You could never be a father." The air in the room evaporated in an instant. Malik sat completely paralyzed. He did not breathe. He did not blink. His arrogant posture crumbled, and he looked like a man who had just been shot directly in the chest and was waiting for the fatal pain to register. He looked down at the medical record sitting in front of his frozen lawyer, seeing the official hospital letterhead, the doctor's signature, the undeniable biological truth of his own profound inadequacy. His large hands began to shake violently against the mahogany table, his entire identity, his pride, His deeply ingrained belief in his own masculine superiority was evaporating in front of a room full of lawyers. He slowly turned his head away from me and looked over his shoulder at his mother. Ruby had collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her trembling hands. She did not deny the accusation. She did not scream at me for lying or fabricating the documents. She just began sobbing loudly, the ugly wet sound tearing through the silent mediation room. "I am so sorry," Malik Ruby wailed, her voice muffled by her fingers. "I wanted to protect your manhood. The doctors told me you were sterile when you were just a boy, but I could not bear to break your heart and tell you the truth. I thought Chantel was a miracle from God. I wanted so desperately to believe it was a miracle that I ignored what I knew." The realization hit Malik with the force of a runaway freight train. His entire grand legacy, his ultimate proof of superiority over me, his ultimate weapon to steal my empire was a complete and total fraud. The children he had been parading around national television, the children he was using to extort me, were not even his blood. He shot out of his chair with a terrifying burst of speed, sending the heavy piece of furniture crashing backward onto the floor. He turned his terrifying manic gaze onto Chantel. Chantel was now shrinking back into her seat, clutching the crying baby against her chest, her eyes wide with absolute mortal panic. She tried to press herself into the wall, trying to escape the monster she had awakened. "Whose babies are these?" Malik roared, the sound ripping from his throat like a wounded, enraged animal. He lunged toward her, his hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists. "Whose kids are these, you lying, manipulative witch? Tell me right now, whose blood is in that baby?" Chantel screamed, trying to scramble out of the chair as Malik's lawyer and the mediator both jumped up and grabbed his arms, trying to physically restrain him from attacking her. Wyatt pushed himself off the back wall, stepping forward with a look of sudden deep horror on his face. He was trying to play the hero, stepping in to protect Chantel from Malik's violent outburst, but his eyes betrayed a deep, sickening panic. He knew exactly what Chantel was hiding, and he realized the walls were closing in on him. But before Wyatt could even reach them, before Chantel could spit out a single desperate lie to save herself, the heavy double doors of the mediation room were violently kicked open. The loud crash of the wood hitting the wall echoed like a gunshot, freezing every single person in their tracks. Malik stopped struggling against the lawyers, his fists still raised in the air. Ruby stopped her pathetic sobbing mid-gasp. Wyatt froze completely mid-step, his face draining of all color. Standing in the doorway, looking like an avenging angel of total destruction, was Ebony. Her clothes were completely disheveled and soaked with rain, her chest heaving with extreme exertion and pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, wild and blazing with a manic, terrifying fire that demanded immediate blood. In her right hand, she was crushing a crumpled piece of white stationery and a brightly colored printed DNA test result. She did not look at her brother Malik, and she did not look at me. Her burning, lethal gaze was locked dead onto her husband Wyatt and the cowering mistress holding the pale infant. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Ebony slowly raised the crumpled papers in her fist, pointing them directly at Wyatt's face. Her voice shook with a rage so deep and profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the courthouse. "Take a good look at your new nephew's face, Wyatt," she whispered, her voice dripping with pure venom. "Take a really good look." "Good." Ebony did not hesitate for a single second. She marched across the thick plush carpet of the mediation room, her wet shoes leaving dark, muddy footprints in her wake. The rain dripped from her soaked hair onto the pristine mahogany table. The air in the room was completely paralyzed. No one breathed. No one moved. The mediator sat frozen with his pen suspended above his legal pad. Stanton stood perfectly still beside me. We were all just an audience to the ultimate implosion of the family that had tried to destroy me. Ebony walked straight up to the side of the table where Chantel was cowering and where Wyatt was desperately trying to calculate an escape route. She slammed the crumpled brown packaging and the brightly colored DNA results down onto the polished mahogany wood right in front of her brother's face. The papers slid across the smooth surface and stopped inches from Malik's trembling hands. Ebony turned her burning, bloodshot eyes toward Chantel, and then toward Wyatt. Her voice did not shake anymore. It was absolute zero. You lied to my brother, Ebony! Screamed the sound tearing through the sterile acoustic tiles of the room. She pointed a shaking finger right at Chantel's terrified face. You lied to my brother and you slept with my husband. That pale little boy you have been parading around as the heir to this family is not a miracle. That white baby is Wyatt's. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. I watched Malik stare at the DNA papers, his brain violently snapping the pieces together. The medical file proving he had been sterile since he was 12 years old was sitting right next to the genetic proof that his sister's husband had been sleeping with his mistress. The two pieces of paper lay side by side on the polished wood, a complete and total indictment of his entire existence. His legacy, his ultimate proof of manhood, his reason for dragging me through this agonizing divorce was nothing but a toxic byproduct of his own family's incestuous betrayal. The realization broke him. The smug, arrogant man who had gone on television just hours ago to paint me as a barren villain was now staring at the undeniable proof that he was the broken one. Chantel let out a high-pitched shriek as Ebony lunged at her. The illusion of the fragile new mother vanished instantly. Ebony grabbed a thick handful of Chantel's carefully styled hair and yanked her backward, pulling her entirely out of the leather chair. Chantel scrambled, dropping the baby blanket as the infant wailed on the floor. Ruby lunged forward to protect the child, scooping the baby up and retreating to the corner, but leaving Chantel to the absolute mercy of Ebony's wrath. The mediator was shouting for security, hitting his wooden gavel against the table in a useless, desperate rhythm that was completely drowned out by the screaming. Wyatt, the man who had spent years looking down his nose at me, the man who played the role of the superior, sophisticated and morally upright brother-in-law, completely lost his facade. His face was drained of all color, matching the pale skin of his illegitimate son. He took one look at the sheer murderous intent radiating from Malik's eyes and decided to save his own skin. He spun around his expensive leather shoes, slipping frantically against the carpet as he bolted toward the open double doors, hoping to leave his wife and his mistress behind to deal with the fallout. But Malik was faster and fueled by a rage that bordered on absolute insanity. He vaulted over the heavy wooden chairs, sending them crashing to the floor. He caught Wyatt just before the doorway, tackling him from behind. The two men hit the ground with a sickening thud. Wyatt scrambled desperately, trying to crawl away into the hallway, begging for someone to call the police. But Malik grabbed him by the collar of his tailored suit jacket and dragged him backward. Malik raised his fist and brought it down hard against Wyatt's face. The sound of bone crunching echoed through the chaos. Wyatt screamed, raising his hands to protect himself, but Malik was relentless, raining down blows, screaming incoherently about betrayal and disrespect and his ruined life. On the other side of the room, the women were tearing each other apart like feral animals. Ebony had Chantel pinned against the side of the conference table, screaming every foul word she could summon, slapping and scratching at the woman who had ruined her marriage. Ruby was rocking back and forth in the corner, clutching the crying baby, weeping for the total destruction of her empire. It was a complete and absolute bloodbath. The wealthy, arrogant, untouchable family that had spent 7 years treating me like a disposable bank account was currently destroying themselves on the floor of a downtown courthouse. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not call for help. I simply sat in my heavy leather chair and watched the carnage unfold with a sense of profound clinical detachment. The air smelled of rain and expensive cologne and the metallic tang of blood. The lawyers were shouting into their phones, demanding the bailiffs. The mediator was backed into a corner, looking absolutely horrified by the primal display of violence happening in his sterile legal sanctuary. I looked down at the mediation papers sitting in front of me, the document Malik's lawyer had drafted, demanding my spas, demanding $50,000 a month in alimony, demanding that I subsidize his fraudulent life. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen that Stanton had placed on the table. I drew a thick, dark line straight through their ridiculous demands, crossing out every single extortion attempt they had tried to force upon me. On the final page, the signature line that officially severed any and all ties to Malik and his parasitic bloodline. I signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a perfect, undeniable mark of my absolute freedom. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their ruin. The screaming around me reached a fever pitch. Wyatt was begging for mercy as Malik held him by the throat, blood staining the collar of his expensive shirt. They were trapped in the hell of their own making, tearing each other apart like savages, and they were going to burn there for a very long time. I placed the pen down. I slowly stood up from the mahogany table, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from my custom-tailored trousers. I reached out and calmly buttoned the single button of my blazer. Stanton looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound professional respect. He did not say a word. He just nodded. I turned my back on the writhing, screaming mass of bodies on the floor. I did not look at Malik. I did not look at Ruby. I walked toward the open doorway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the small sections of exposed hardwood floor. I stepped over Wyatt's expensive leather shoe where he lay bleeding on the carpet, entirely ignoring his pathetic pleas for help. I walked out of the mediation room and pulled the heavy oak double doors shut behind me. The thick wood clicked into place, instantly muffling the sounds of the violence and the wailing. The long corridor of the courthouse was empty and perfectly silent. The overhead lights hummed with a quiet, steady energy. I stood there in the calm, sterile hallway and closed my eyes. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cool, clean air into my lungs. The heavy weight of the last 7 years completely vanished from my shoulders. The nightmare was finally over, and the air tasted exactly like victory. I walked out of the courthouse and never looked back. The destruction I left in that mediation room was absolute and final. In the weeks that followed, the entire false empire of Malik's family collapsed into ash. The judge threw out Malik's ridiculous demands for alimony and child support. The second the medical records and the new DNA evidence were entered into the official record, Malik was stripped of every single asset he tried to claim. The federal fraud charges for the stolen corporate funds stuck to him like glue, leaving him completely bankrupt and drowning in legal debt. He went from a smug television victim to a broken man facing absolute ruin. Chantel became the ultimate cautionary tale in our community. The tabloids and local blogs had a field day when the police reports from the courthouse brawl were leaked. She went from a pampered mistress to a local laughingstock completely broke and raising 2 infants fathered by 2 different men who absolutely despised her. Ebony did not waste a single second filing for a scorched earth divorce. She packed Wyatt's bags and threw them onto their manicured lawn. She made sure every partner at his insurance brokerage knew exactly why they were divorcing. Wyatt was fired within the week, his prestigious reputation completely shredded by his own disgusting betrayal. He lost his license, his wife, and his country club status all in one fell swoop, and Ruby, the grand matriarch who thought she could manipulate the truth to save her son's pride, faced the most poetic justice of all. The eviction went through exactly 29 days later. She was dragged out of the Decatur property with nowhere to go. But the worst punishment for Ruby was the social execution. The ladies at her precious church found out exactly what she had covered up. They learned she had hidden the fact that her son-in-law was sleeping with her son's mistress, just to protect her own fragile ego. The entire congregation shunned her. The woman who had locked me on a porch in the freezing rain to teach me a lesson was now permanently locked out of the only community she cared about. I felt absolutely no pity for any of them. I cut the dead weight from my life, and I focused entirely on my own ascension. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the bright modern lobby of my newest and largest wellness center, right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The walls were painted a pristine white, and the air smelled of eucalyptus and fresh beginnings. I wore a tailored emerald green suit, feeling more powerful and radiant than I ever had in my entire life. The mayor was standing next to me, holding a pair of oversized golden scissors for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. A crowd of supporters, investors, and local media were gathered outside, cheering as I smiled for the cameras. Just as I reached out to grasp the handles of the scissors, I felt a sudden vibration in the pocket of my blazer. I pulled out my phone and looked at the screen. It was an incoming call from an unknown number. I did not need caller ID to know exactly who was on the other end. It was Malik calling from a burner phone, desperate and begging from the bottom of the pit he dug for himself. I stared at the screen for exactly 1 second. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as my thumb pressed the red block button, permanently erasing him from my existence. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, took the golden scissors, and cut the thick silk ribbon in front of me. The crowd erupted into applause. I stepped forward, leaving the shadows of the past behind me, and walked confidently into the bright, brilliant empire I had built with my own 2 hands. No one would ever define my worth again. The ultimate lesson from this narrative is that your worth is never defined by those who try to break you. When faced with toxic and manipulative people, the greatest revenge isn't matching their chaos. It is handing them the undeniable truth and walking away. Harper did not need to scream or fight to win. She simply set firm boundaries and let their own lies destroy their fragile foundation. True empowerment comes from recognizing your value, severing ties with those who drain your energy, and pouring your focus entirely into building your own empire. Silence and self-respect remain the ultimate mic drop. Drop a like and subscribe for more empowering stories, and share how you found the strength to walk away from toxic situations in the comments below.